When we come to the end of the dynasty of Jehu, we find that it is really just a few years before the northern kingdom ceased to exist. We have Shalom. He took the throne from Zechariah, the son of Jeroboam II. He reigned for 1 month, and then he was killed by Menahem. And so this shows that it was a time of great instability and civil war. And then we have Menahem reigning for 10 years. This is the first mention of the Assyrians in chapter 15, verse 19. We read that Paul of Assyria came against the land. Menahem gave Paul 1,000 talents of silver so that he might help him confirm his hold on royal power. In other words, Menahem looked to the Assyrians to support his coup, and he became a vassal of Assyria. And the king we meet is King Pul, otherwise known as Tiglath-Pileser. He goes under 2 names. Now, I'm going to take time to look at the Assyrian Empire with you and how it relates to Scripture, and the same for the Babylonians. These are important things, so we will come back to this. But then we have Pekahiah, Menahem's son. He reigned for 2 years, but then he was killed by Pekah. Pekah reigned for 20 years. There was a continual interaction between him and the Assyrians. It was the Assyrians during his reign in 732 who took away Galilee and the Transjordan. So these were now completely lost to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom basically consisted of the what was the tribe of Ephraim that was left, and then eventually he was killed by Hoshea, and Hoshea was the last of the northern kings. He reigned 9 years. He was taken into captivity to Assyria, and the Assyrians sieged Samaria, and after 3 years, in 722, the northern kingdom ceased to exist. Chapter 17 is a really important commentary on this, and you will want to take great note of that chapter. Just to draw your attention to verse 7. Chapter 17, verse 7. Having talked about the final destruction of the northern kingdom, we read, "This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." And then it explains in detail what it was that they did and why the final destruction came. Notice verse 13. "Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I command your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. But you would not listen." See, this is such a tragic chapter. God did everything, and we have seen that, to get their attention, that they would turn away, but they didn't. Verse 16. "They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast images of 2 calves. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and their daughters pass through fire, and they used divination and augury, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger." And so we see all of the awfulness of the worship of the Canaanites here through the northern kingdom. And we have seen the grace of God in all that he sought to do to bring them back to himself. But they refused. Just to say that it can be helpful to have some significant dates in your mind, because this can then become like a framework to help to understand the history of this book. This becomes especially helpful when you come to the prophets and seeing how the prophets fit in. The division of the kingdom was round about 931. That's a date that's understood by many. And the fall of the northern kingdom is 722. Now the southern kingdom continues for a while, but the northern kingdom fell in 722. I have there in how 730, round about 730, we have the Syro-Ephraimitic coalition. And we'll talk more about that when we look at the Assyrians. It's this that Isaiah has so much to say in chapter 7 to 12. It's when the Syrians and the northern kingdom joined forces against Judah. Syro stands for Syria or Aram. Ephraimitic, that's Ephraim, that's Israel, and that's how people refer to that particular coalition. And it's spoken about briefly in chapter 15, verse 37. Just briefly to draw you back to Exodus 34, here when we have this description of God, I believe that what we have seen in Kings is in many ways a commentary on this. We've seen how slow God is to anger. We've seen how merciful and gracious he is. We've seen how he was patient, bringing prophets, working miracles. As soon as there was a change, he was quick to forgive iniquity, transgression and sin. But there came a point when judgment fell. The awfulness of the idolatry had to come to an end. And we see God stepping in 722. And of course, that had consequences on the children as they all went into captivity. But now we have 10 tribes that were scattered in captivity. People talk about the 10 lost tribes. Well, they were not lost. They were taken into captivity, and we now have Jewish communities all over Assyria and beyond. And these are going to be referred to as we continue our studies.